The Allied fleet spread across the battlefield like a wave of righteous fury. Ships from species that had never fought together now moved in perfect coordination. They had one goal and one enemy, and nothing else mattered. Admiral Nathan Cole commanded the combined assault from the bridge of Captain Diana Walsh's damaged destroyer. His own flagship was nothing but drifting wreckage, but the fight was far from over. He studied the tactical display and began issuing orders to fleet commanders he had never met. The Turellians took the left flank with their heavy cruisers. The Vexians swept around the right with their fast attack ships. A dozen other species filled in the gaps, each bringing their unique strengths to the battle. And at the center of the formation, battered but unbroken, the human fleet pushed forward. Warlord Thax refused to retreat. The Krath had never known defeat, and he would not be the first to surrender. He ordered his remaining ships to concentrate fire on the human vessels, determined to destroy the species that had started this catastrophe. But his fleet was no longer facing desperate defenders. They were facing an angry galaxy. The final battle was brutal and costly. Ships on both sides exploded into clouds of debris. Escape pods launched into the chaos, some reaching safety and others destroyed by stray fire. The void between the fleets became so thick with wreckage that navigation was nearly impossible. On the ground, Sergeant Marcus Hill led his exhausted soldiers in a final counterattack. Allied ground forces had begun landing across the planet, reinforcing the human positions and pushing back the Krath invaders. The Krath ground troops fought with desperate fury, but they were now facing enemies on every side. Turellian heavy infantry smashed through their lines. Vexian commandos struck from the shadows. And everywhere, human soldiers pressed the attack with a ferocity born of days of bitter combat. The siege around the refugee camps finally broke. Valoran civilians emerged from their hiding places to find Allied soldiers standing guard instead of Krath killers. Many of them collapsed in tears. Some simply stood and stared at the sky, unable to believe they were still alive. Captain Diana Walsh volunteered for the most dangerous mission of the battle. Someone needed to destroy Warlord Thax's command ship before he could rally his forces for another assault. Her destroyer was barely functional, but it was fast and its crew was willing. Admiral Cole tried to stop her. He pointed out that the mission was suicide. The ship could not survive the approach, let alone the attack. Captain Walsh smiled and reminded him that her ship was going to fall apart anyway. She might as well make it count for something. The Defiance accelerated toward the Krath command ship, weaving through a storm of enemy fire. Walsh pushed her damaged engines beyond every safety limit, coaxing speed from systems that should have failed hours ago. Krath weapons struck her ship again and again. Entire sections went dark. Crew members died at their stations. But the Defiance kept coming. Warlord Thax watched the human destroyer approach and felt that cold fear grip his hearts again. He ordered every gun on his ship to fire at the tiny vessel. He screamed at his crews to destroy it. It was not enough. Defiance reached optimal firing range and unleashed everything it had left. Missiles and plasma rounds and kinetic projectiles slammed into the Krath command ship at point-blank range. Walsh targeted the reactor core, the bridge, the weapon systems. Every shot hit home. The Krath flagship began to break apart. Explosions rippled across its massive hull. Warlord Thax had just enough time to realize he had lost before the final detonation consumed him and his ship. The remaining Krath forces saw their command ship explode and their will to fight shattered. They had followed Warlord Thax because he was invincible. Now he was dead, and they were alone against a galaxy that had finally decided to fight back. The Krath fleet scattered into the void, fleeing toward the galactic rim with Allied ships in pursuit. Some were caught and destroyed. Others escaped into deep space. The threat was not eliminated, but it was broken. On the surface of Valoran Prime, The last Krath ground troops surrendered or died fighting. The battle was finally over. The aftermath revealed the terrible cost of victory. Thousands of human soldiers were dead. Dozens of ships were destroyed. Allied losses added thousands more to the count, but the Valorans had survived. Billions of them would live to see another sunrise, because humans had answered a distress call that no one else would. Admiral Cole faced charges for his unauthorized mission. The Galactic Assembly convened a tribunal to decide his fate. Representatives from across the galaxy attended, including many who had condemned his actions just days before. Ambassador Helen Torres spoke for Earth. She was a dignified woman with silver hair and steady hands. She did not apologize for what humanity had done. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply explained. Humans answer distress calls. It was what they did. It was who they were. When someone cried out for help, humans came running. That was not a choice or a policy. It was a fundamental truth. The Galactic Assembly could punish humanity for this if they wished. They could impose sanctions and isolation, but it would not change anything. The next time someone called for help, humans would answer again. Kira Vlox spoke next. She described what the humans had done for her people. She named the soldiers who had died protecting strangers. She shared the stories of medics who had risked everything to save Valoran lives. She asked the Assembly a simple question. When the next crisis came, would they answer the call? Or would they stand aside again? The tribunal voted unanimously to drop all charges against Admiral Cole. 3 days later, they voted to admit humanity to the High Council of the Galactic Assembly. It was the fastest advancement in galactic history. Weeks later, Admiral Cole visited a memorial on Valoran Prime. The Valorans had built it to honor those who had fallen in their defense. Human names and Valoran names were carved side by side into a wall of white stone. He stood before the memorial for a long time, reading the names of soldiers who had trusted him enough to follow him into an impossible battle. He felt the weight of their sacrifice and promised himself he would never forget it. A young Valoran child approached him cautiously. She was small and blue-skinned and looked at him with wide, curious eyes. She asked him why humans had come to help her people when no one else would. It was the same question Kira had asked. The same question the Assembly had debated. The same question the entire galaxy was trying to understand. Admiral Cole knelt down to meet her eyes. He thought about all the speeches he could give, all the explanations about human nature and moral duty and the obligations of the strong to protect the weak. But in the end, the answer was simpler than any of that. He told her that someone was in trouble and humans could help. That was all the reason they ever needed. The child considered this for a moment. Then she smiled and took his hand. Together, they walked among the memorial, honoring the fallen and celebrating the living. Above them, the stars shone bright with the promise of a galaxy that had finally learned what humanity had always known. No one should face the darkness alone. The ground shook with every explosion as Sergeant Marcus Hill led his soldiers through the burning streets of the Valoran capital. They had landed 6 hours ago and had been fighting ever since. The Krath ground forces were everything the briefings had promised and worse. They were massive creatures, towering over the human soldiers like nightmares made flesh. Their armored hides could shrug off small arms' fire. Their claws could tear through body armor like paper. And they seemed to feel no fear, but the humans did not retreat. They held their positions with a ferocity that confused the Krath commanders. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a kill zone. The humans used tactics the Krath had never encountered, falling back only to strike from unexpected angles. Sergeant Hill had established a defensive perimeter around the largest concentration of Valoran survivors. Nearly 2 million civilians huddled in the ruins of what had once been a grand university. They had no weapons and no training, All they could do was wait and pray. The craft threw wave after wave of ground troops at the human positions. Each assault was repelled, but at a terrible cost. Human soldiers fell defending people they had never met, people who spoke a language they could not understand, people whose culture was entirely alien to them. None of that mattered. They were innocent, and they needed protection. That was enough. Captain Diana Walsh commanded her battered destroyer from a bridge that was barely functional. Half her crew was dead or wounded. Her ship had more holes in it than hull plating. But she refused to leave the battle. Admiral Cole had ordered her to withdraw for repairs twice. She had acknowledged the orders and ignored them both times. There would be time for repairs when the Valorans were safe. Until then, she would fight with whatever she had left. The fleet was in desperate shape. Human ships that had been sleek and proud now limped through space, trailing debris and venting atmosphere. Every vessel was damaged. Many were held together by nothing more than emergency, welding, and the determination of their crews, but they were still fighting. Kira Velox worked alongside human field medics in a makeshift hospital near the refugee camp. Her species had unparalleled medical knowledge, and she shared everything she knew without hesitation. Human doctors and Valoran healers worked side by side, saving lives that would have been lost without their combined expertise. She watched a human medic risk his life to retrieve a wounded Valoran child from a collapsed building. Craft snipers were active in the area, and 2 other humans had already died trying to reach the child. But the medic went anyway. He made it back with the child in his arms and a craft bullet in his shoulder. He handed the child to Kira and then collapsed from blood loss. The other medics dragged him to safety while Valoran healers worked to save his life. Kira held the trembling child and wondered what kind of species would do this. What kind of people would cross the galaxy to die for strangers? She had no answer. Warlord Thax launched his largest assault yet. Every ship in his fleet fired simultaneously, creating a wall of destruction that swept toward the human positions. He was done playing games. He would crush these humans with pure, overwhelming force. Admiral Cole saw the attack coming and knew his fleet could not survive it. The math was simple and brutal. The craft had too many ships, too many weapons, too much firepower. He made a decision that would become legend. The Admiral ordered his flagship to maximum acceleration, aiming directly at the heart of the craft formation. His crew understood what he was doing. They did not hesitate. The human flagship plowed through the craft barrage, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed 3 normal vessels. Armor plating melted away. Weapon systems exploded. Entire sections of the ship went dark, but the flagship kept coming. It struck the shields of Warlord Thax's command ship at full speed, creating a massive breach in the defenses. In that moment of chaos, other human ships poured fire through the gap, striking the craft flagship with everything they had. The command ship shuddered under the assault. Critical systems failed. Warlord Thax roared orders that no one could follow because the communication systems were destroyed. Admiral Cole's flagship was crippled beyond repair. It drifted away from the battle, powerless and broken. But the Admiral was still alive, and so were most of his crew. On the ground, Sergeant Hill saw the explosion in orbit and knew something important had happened. He rallied his exhausted soldiers for one more push, driving the craft back from the refugee camp with a counterattack that should have been impossible. The craft ground forces began to falter. Their commanders were in disarray. Their reinforcements were not arriving as promised. And these humans would not stop fighting no matter how many of them died. Across the galaxy, other species watched the battle unfold through long-range sensors and intercepted communications. They had expected the humans to be destroyed quickly. They had prepared eulogies and empty condolences. Instead, they watched humanity refused to die. The Galactic Assembly received continuous updates on the situation. Representatives who had voted to abandon the Valorans now sat in uncomfortable silence. Representatives who had condemned Admiral Cole's actions found themselves unable to meet the eyes of their colleagues. And then the sensors detected something that changed everything. New contacts emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. For one terrible moment, Admiral Cole assumed they were Krath reinforcements. His heart sank as he imagined his battered fleet being swept away by fresh enemy forces. Then, identification signals came through. The ships were not Krath. They were Turellian and Vexian and a dozen other species. They had come from across the galaxy, drawn by something they had never felt before. Shame. They had watched humanity fight alone for days. They had watched humans die for strangers while the rest of the galaxy did nothing. And finally, at long last, they had decided they could not live with themselves if they continued to stand aside. Admiral Cole stared at the viewscreen as the Allied fleet took position alongside his battered ships. A voice came over the communication channel. It was the Turellian commander, a species known for their caution and careful diplomacy. The Turellian said only one thing: "We should have come sooner, Admiral." Cole allowed himself a tired smile. Better late than never. Warlord Thax looked at the new arrivals and finally understood what was happening. The humans had not just come to fight. They had come to inspire. For the first time in his long and bloody career, Warlord Thax felt something cold creep into his heart's fear. Warlord Thax stood on the command bridge of his flagship and watched the human fleet approach. He was enormous even by Krath standards, nearly 9 feet of muscle and armored hide. His claws had torn through the bodies of 1,000 enemies, and his fleet had exterminated 3 species before the Valorans. He studied the human vessels with something close to amusement. They were small and fragile compared to Krath warships. Their weapons appeared primitive. Their numbers were insignificant. Thax opened the communication channel to the approaching fleet. He wanted these creatures to understand what they faced before they died. His translators converted his words into human language, and his message broadcast across every human ship. He told them they were fools. He told them they would die screaming like the Valorans. He told them to turn back now and he might let them live long enough to watch their own world burn. Admiral Nathan Cole listened to the message in silence. When it ended, he activated his own communication channel and spoke. A single response: "We are here for our friends." Thax stared at his viewscreen in confusion. Friends? The word made no sense to him. The Krath had no friends. They had prey, and they had each other. Nothing else mattered. He ordered his fleet to attack. The battle began with a barrage of Krath weapons fire that lit up the void like a second sun. Their ships moved forward in perfect formation, confident in their overwhelming superiority. They expected the humans to break and run like every other species they had faced. The humans did not run. Captain Diana Walsh led her destroyer squadron straight into the debris field, using the wreckage of Valoran ships as cover. The Krath hesitated because no sane species would fly into such dangerous territory. But the humans were not playing by the rules the Krath understood. The Defiance and her sister ships emerged from the debris cloud at close range, too close for the massive Krath weapons to track effectively. Human guns blazed at point-blank distance, punching through Krath armor in ways the enemy had not expected. The first Krath capital ship exploded in a ball of fire. Then another. Then a third. Warlord Thax watched in disbelief. His fleet had not suffered casualties like this in decades. These tiny human ships were supposed to die quickly and cleanly. Instead, they were fighting like cornered animals, vicious and unpredictable. Lieutenant Kevin Park had been transferred to Admiral Cole's flagship as Tactical Communications Officer. He monitored craft transmissions throughout the battle, feeding intelligence to the fleet commanders. What he heard surprised him. The craft were confused. Their communications were filled with questions and complaints. The humans were not behaving the way prey was supposed to behave. When human ships were damaged, other human ships moved to protect them instead of abandoning them. When escape pods launched from crippled vessels, humans risked their lives to rescue the survivors. This made no sense to the craft. Resources spent protecting the weak were resources wasted. Damaged assets should be abandoned. That was the efficient way. The logical way. But humans were not logical. They were stubborn and emotional, and absolutely unwilling to leave anyone behind. Admiral Cole commanded the battle from his flagship, coordinating dozens of engagements across the battlefield. His ships were taking damage. Some had already been lost, but they were giving far better than they received. The human weapons, designed for efficiency rather than intimidation, proved devastatingly effective. What they lacked in raw power they made up for in precision. Human gunners targeted weak points in craft armor, exploiting gaps that the overconfident enemy had never bothered to reinforce. Captain Walsh pushed her damaged destroyer through a wall of enemy fire to reach a crippled human frigate. A crew worked frantically to evacuate the survivors while craft ships closed in around them. They should have retreated. Every tactical calculation said to abandon the frigate and save themselves. Walsh refused. She held her position until every last survivor was aboard, then fought her way back through the enemy line with half her weapons destroyed and her hull venting atmosphere. The first engagement lasted 4 hours. When it ended, both fleets pulled back to regroup. The craft had lost more ships than they had in any battle for the past century. The humans had lost fewer, but they could not afford any losses at all. Warlord Thax stood in the ruins of his tactical center, surrounded by damage reports and casualty lists. His officers waited nervously for orders. None of them had ever seen the warlord so quiet. He finally spoke, and his words chilled everyone who heard them. These humans were different. They did not fight for survival or resources. They fought for something else entirely, something the craft could not understand. This made them dangerous. On the surface of Valoran Prime, survivors huddled in the ruins of their once beautiful cities. They had watched the sky for days, seeing nothing but craft warships and falling bombs. They had given up hope. They had accepted that no one was coming to save them. Then the explosions started in orbit. Valoran eyes turned upward and saw something impossible. Ships were fighting the craft. Small ships with unfamiliar designs were actually pushing back against the monsters that had destroyed everything. Admiral Cole's voice broadcast across every frequency, cutting through the craft jamming signals. His message was simple, and it brought tears to millions of Valoran eyes. Hold on. We are coming. Kira Velox listened to the message from the human flagship. She had escaped the massacre to warn others, never believing anyone would actually help. Now she watched human soldiers prepare for ground operations, ready to die for people they had never met. She asked one of them why. Why would humans sacrifice themselves for strangers from another world? The soldier smiled and checked her weapon. She said it was because someone needed help, and that was reason enough. Kira did not fully understand. Her people had always believed in peace and negotiation. The concept of fighting to protect others was alien to them. But watching these humans prepare for battle, she began to understand something important. Sometimes, peace required people willing to fight for it. Sometimes the only answer to violence was greater violence in defense of the innocent. The humans were teaching her a lesson her people had never learned. Warlord Thax summoned reinforcements from the Galactic Rim. He would not underestimate these humans again. The next battle would be different. He would crush them with overwhelming force and then continue his extermination of the Valorans. What he did not realize was that the humans were just getting started. The news spread across Earth like wildfire. Admiral Nathan Cole had defied the Galactic Assembly and mobilized the Third Fleet to rescue the Valorans. Politicians scrambled to respond. Some demanded his immediate arrest, while others praised his courage. But the people of Earth had already made up their minds. Recruitment centers that had been quiet for years suddenly overflowed with volunteers. Young men and women lined up around the block, waiting for their chance to join the mission. Veterans who had retired decades ago dusted off their uniforms and reported for duty. Within hours, Admiral Cole had more volunteers than he could possibly use. Captain Diana Walsh stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Defiance and watched the fleet assemble. She was a compact woman with short brown hair and a scar that ran across her left cheek from a border skirmish years ago. She had seen combat before, but nothing like what they were about to face. Dr. Samuel Green joined her on the bridge. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a nervous habit of adjusting his glasses. As the fleet's xenobiologist and cultural advisor, it was his job to help the crew understand what they were fighting for. He explained the Valorans to anyone who would listen. They were an ancient species, far older than humanity. They had achieved technological wonders that humans could barely comprehend. But they had channeled all their genius into healing rather than destruction. They had cured diseases that plagued 100 worlds. They had extended lifespans and eliminated suffering wherever they went. And now they were being murdered because they had never learned to fight back. Captain Walsh asked Dr. Green about the Krath. His expression darkened as he pulled up the data they had gathered. The Krath were predators in every sense of the word. They were larger and stronger than humans. Their ships outclassed human vessels in raw firepower, and they had a reputation for absolute brutality. The Krath did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. They conquered and they consumed. Some reports suggested they harvested the bodies of their victims for biological resources. Whether this was true or propaganda, no one knew for certain. But it painted a terrifying picture. A young Valoran named Kira Velox had been brought aboard the flagship to provide intelligence. She was the same survivor who had contacted Earth during the initial distress call. Now she walked the corridors of a human warship, still trembling from everything she had witnessed. Kira met with Admiral Cole and the senior officers to share what she knew about Krath tactics. They struck fast and hard, overwhelming defenses before anyone could respond. They targeted civilian populations first because terror was their greatest weapon. And they never stopped until every last member of the enemy species was dead. Admiral Cole listened without interruption. When Kira finished, he thanked her for her courage and promised that her people would not face this alone. The Galactic Assembly officially condemned Earth's actions the next day. They threatened economic sanctions and political isolation. Some species withdrew their ambassadors from Earth in protest. The message was clear. Humanity was on its own, but Admiral Cole had expected this. He addressed the fleet through a recorded message that played on every ship. He did not make speeches about glory or victory. He simply told them the truth. They were going to fight an enemy that was stronger and more numerous. They would be outgunned and outnumbered. Many of them would not come home, but somewhere in the darkness, innocent people were dying. People who had never harmed anyone. People who had shown humanity nothing but kindness. And the rest of the galaxy had decided to look away. He asked if that was acceptable. The answer came back from every ship in the fleet. A roar of defiance that echoed through the communication channels. During the journey to Valoran space, human engineers worked around the clock to modify their weapons and shields. They had limited data on Krath technology, but they were creative and determined. They reinforced hull plating with experimental alloys. They overclocked weapon systems beyond safety limits. They programmed new tactical algorithms based on what little they knew about craft behavior. Captain Wash trained her crew relentlessly. Every hour that was not spent on modifications was spent on drills. Combat simulations ran constantly, each one more difficult than the last. She pushed her people to their limits because she knew the real battle would push them even further. Other species across the galaxy watched the human fleet with a mixture of amazement and horror. They could not understand why these primitive newcomers were throwing themselves into certain destruction. The craft were unbeatable. Everyone knew this. And yet the humans kept coming. Some species quietly wished them luck. Others prepared their own defenses, grateful that someone else would buy them time. A few began to question whether they should have done more. The journey took 6 days. 6 days of preparation and prayer. 6 days of wondering what waited for them at the end, when the fleet finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Valoran space. Every crew member knew their lives had changed forever. Captain Walsh stood on her bridge and stared at the view screen. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The space before them was filled with debris. Broken ships and shattered stations tumbled through the void. What had once been a thriving trade route was now a graveyard. And beyond the debris field, stretching across the horizon like a wall of darkness, was the Krath invasion fleet. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Each one was massive, bristling with weapons that glowed with an angry red light. They hung in space like predators waiting for prey. Admiral Cole's voice came over the fleet communication channel. It was calm and steady, despite the impossible odds displayed on every screen. He reminded them why they were here. Not for glory, not for conquest. They were here because someone had called for help, and no one else had answered. The Valorans were still alive down on that burning world. Billions of them hiding in the ruins of their civilization, waiting for a miracle. They had given up hope. They had accepted that the galaxy had abandoned them. Today, they would learn differently. Admiral Cole gave the order to advance. The human fleet moved forward into the debris field, every ship ready for battle. Every crew member prepared to fight and die for people they had never met. The Krath saw them coming and did not seem concerned. They had destroyed countless species before. One more would make no difference. They were about to learn what happened when humanity got angry. The signal came at 3 in the morning, when most of the Pacific Deep Space Monitoring Station was running on skeleton crew. Lieutenant Kevin Park was halfway through his 4th cup of coffee when his console began flashing red. He set down his mug and leaned forward because red alerts were rare and usually meant equipment malfunction. But this was no malfunction. The signal was weak at first, barely cutting through the background noise of the cosmos. Kevin adjusted the receivers and cleaned up the transmission. What emerged made his blood run cold. It was a distress call, but not just any distress call. This one used an ancient emergency protocol that predated the Galactic Assembly by thousands of years. It was the kind of signal a species only sent when extinction was at the door. Kevin immediately contacted Commander Laura Bennett, who arrived at the monitoring station within 20 minutes. She was a tall woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too many crises to panic easily. But when she heard the signal and saw the accompanying visual data, even she went pale. The transmission came from the Valoran sector, a peaceful region of space inhabited by one of the kindest species humanity had ever encountered. The Valorans were healers and scholars. They had welcomed humans into the galactic community 50 years ago when Earth first achieved faster-than-light travel. They had shared their medical knowledge freely and asked for nothing in return. Now they were dying. The visual feed showed Valoran cities burning. Massive ships hung in the orange sky, raining fire upon buildings that had stood for 10,000 years. Bodies littered the streets. The screams in the transmission needed no translation. Commander Bennett contacted Admiral Nathan Cole immediately. The Admiral was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who had spent his entire life in service to Earth's defense forces. He arrived at the station within the hour and watched the transmission in complete silence. His jaw tightened with every passing second. The attackers were identified as the Krath Dominion, an empire from the galactic rim that had been nothing more than rumors until now. They were massive creatures, standing nearly 8 feet tall with armored skin and claws that could tear through steel. Their ships were brutal things designed for one purpose only: destruction. Admiral Cole sent an emergency request to the Galactic Assembly, hoping for a swift response. The Assembly convened within hours, which was remarkably fast for a bureaucracy that usually took weeks to schedule meetings. Representatives from dozens of species argued and debated while the Lorans continued to die. The final decision came down like a hammer. The Galactic Assembly would pursue diplomatic negotiations with the Krath Dominion. No military action would be taken. The risk of a wider war was deemed too great. Admiral Cole stood in the communications center and listened to the verdict. His hands were clenched at his sides. Commander Bennett watched him carefully because she knew that look in his eyes. It was the look of a man being told to abandon people who needed help. The distress signal continued to play in the background. Every few minutes, a new voice would break through the static, begging for someone to help them. A mother crying for her children. An elder praying to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. A young voice asking why no one was coming. Lieutenant Kevin Park worked through the night to establish direct contact with the Valoran survivors. It took hours of careful work, but finally a face appeared on the screen. Her name was Kira Velox, and she was barely an adult by Valoran standards. Her pale blue skin was streaked with ash, and her large dark eyes were filled with terror. She told them everything. The Krath had appeared without warning. Their fleet had overwhelmed Valoran defenses in minutes because the Valorans had no real defenses. They were pacifists who had not built a weapon in generations. The Krath were not interested in conquest or resources. They wanted only one thing: extermination. Millions had already died. Billions more would follow within days if nothing changed. Kira begged them to do something, anything. She did not care about politics or protocols. She just wanted her people to survive. Commander Bennett looked at Admiral Cole after the transmission ended. The old warrior's face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. They burned with something that went beyond anger. The Assembly's orders were clear. Stand down. Do not engage. Wait for diplomatic solutions. Admiral Cole walked to the window and stared out at the stars. Somewhere out there, an entire species was being slaughtered while the galaxy watched and did nothing. The Valorans had never harmed anyone. They had spent their existence healing the sick and advancing knowledge. And now they were being exterminated simply because they could not fight back. He thought about the oath he had taken when he first put on the uniform. He had sworn to protect the innocent and defend those who could not defend themselves. That oath had no exceptions for political convenience. Commander Bennett approached him quietly. She had served under Admiral Cole for 15 years, and she knew him better than most. She could see the battle being fought behind his eyes. She asked him what he was thinking, and he did not answer right away. The distress signal was still playing somewhere in the station. Another voice crying out for help that was not coming. Finally, Admiral Cole turned away from the window. He looked at Commander Bennett and then at Lieutenant Kevin Park. Both of them waited in silence. The Admiral picked up the fleet-wide communication device. His finger hovered over the activation button for just a moment. He knew what this would mean. Court-martial, disgrace, possibly imprisonment. He would be throwing away a career that spanned 4 decades. But somewhere in the dark, people were dying. People who had welcomed humanity with open arms. People who had asked for nothing except friendship. Admiral Cole pressed the button. The device crackled to life, connecting him to every ship in the Third Fleet. Captains and crew members across dozens of vessels waited to hear what their commander would say. He spoke only 2 words before cutting the disc. Transmission. Battle stations. The effect was immediate. Across Earth's orbit, engines roared to life. Weapons systems powered up. Crews rushed to their positions with a speed that surprised even their commanding officers. They had all heard the distress signal. They had all seen the images. And now they finally had permission to do something about it. Commander Bennett stood beside Admiral Cole as the fleet began to move. She asked him if he understood what he was risking. The Admiral nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. But some things mattered more than careers or regulations. Some things mattered more than playing it safe. The Valons had sent a call for help into the void, expecting no answer. They had believed themselves alone, abandoned by a galaxy that valued stability over justice. They were about to learn that humanity answered distress calls, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. When someone cried out for help, humans came running, and heaven helped anyone who stood in their way.